The collar came off at dusk. That's where I want to start. Not with the throne room, not with the politics, not with the war that came after. With that single moment. Iron hinges folding open. A woman's bare neck catching the last of the evening light. And the thing underneath it. Older than any of them. Older than the kingdom they thought they'd built on silence. Staring back at the court like an accusation they'd all agreed to forget. She didn't make a sound. That's what I keep coming back to. A lesser woman might have trembled, might have wept, or reached up to cover it, or looked to someone for rescue. Nessa did none of those things. She stood there with her chin level and her wrists still raw from the river crossing, and she let them look. Let them understand what they were seeing. Let the silence do what no speech ever could. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You didn't come here for the end. You came here for the beginning, for the wound that made the end possible. So let me take you back. 3 days before the collar came off. Before the mark. Before any of it. The barge reached the river bend at mid-morning, and by the time it docked at the gray stones quay of Aldenmore Keep, there were already people watching from the wall. Nessa counted them. Old habit. 11 guards on the western parapet. 2 scholars in gray. The ones who kept the lineage scrolls, she knew the robes, and 1 man standing slightly apart from the others. At the farthest edge of the wall walk, close enough to the drop that any lesser lord would have pulled him back. He didn't look down at the barge, he looked at the horizon. Like the arrival of tribute brides was the dullest feature of his morning. She filed that away. Her wrists were bound at the front, which was a small mercy, and she'd been given a clean shift in the last town, which was not mercy so much as presentation. You don't deliver a shoddy gift. The collar was iron, older than her, engraved on the outer face with the sigil of the Thornvale Assembly. The governing council that had sent her here as a peace offering, a human arrangement dressed up in pack law. They called it tribute. Everyone knew what it was. She was a political transaction made to look like custom. She kept her eyes forward as they walked her up the quay. The keep smelled of river clay and pine smoke and the animal musk of a large pack, dozens of wolves in close quarters, a smell like cold water and old stone and something underneath it, warm, that she couldn't name. She breathed through it carefully. She had learned, long ago, that the body gives things away when the mind is trying not to, and the worst thing you could do, walking into an alpha's court, was let your nostrils flare. Lord Cavan met them at the inner gate. He was a thick-necked man with a jaw like a shovel blade and a scar that split his left eyebrow in 2. Her first read of him was that he was the kind of man who had earned his position through a combination of genuine competence and complete comfort with cruelty. His unique mark was that scar, pink against the gray of his skin, pulling his left eye into a permanent slight squint. "Tribute, girl." His voice was pleasantly flat, which was somehow worse than contempt. Lord Cavan. She kept her own voice equally neutral. He looked at her the way you look at a ledger. "You're older than the last one." 22, she said. Old enough to walk up the quay without assistance. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not quite amusement. More like recalibration. He made a note in the leather-bound book he carried and stepped aside. They walked her into the keep. Aldenmore was the kind of castle that had been built in layers over centuries, each generation adding rooms and corridors with no real plan, so that the result was a place that felt organic in the way that growths are organic. Sprawling, dense, turning in on itself. She counted doorways, noted which guards changed at which intersections. She had done this in every building she had lived in since she was 12 years old, and she was not going to stop now. They put her in a room that was technically better than a cell. Stone walls, a sleeping pallet, a window set too high to see anything except a wedge of gray sky. A basin with cold water, no bolt on the door, which was more disconcerting than bars would have been. It said, clearly, that they weren't worried about her going anywhere. She sat on the edge of the pallet and pressed her wrists together and waited. That's who Nessa was in the first hours. A woman who waited well, who sat perfectly still in a small room and catalogued every sound: the guard's boots on the corridor stone, the distant shout of the practice yard, the creak of the keep in the afternoon wind, and let none of it show on her face. Her unique physical detail, the one thing that gave her away if you knew how to read it. Her left hand. She had broken 2 fingers of it as a child, and they'd set badly. The smallest 2, leaning toward each other at a slight angle, touching at the tips. When she was thinking hard, she pressed them together without realizing it, that small, crooked pair of fingers finding each other like they were reminding her of something. She was pressing them together now. She was thinking about the bonding rite. Specifically, about what happened during it. She had asked, carefully, in the last town and gotten an answer from one of the older women in the inn. A woman named Morvith, who had laughed a little too long and then told her, over her cup of something dark and bitter smelling, "They take the collar off during the rite. It's symbolic. The old line's collar, replaced by the alpha's protection." Supposedly. She'd shrugged. For tribute brides, it's more for show. But they do take it off. Nessa had nodded and thanked her and poured more of the dark drink into the woman's cup and said nothing else. She hadn't been thinking about what the removal of the collar would mean for the bonding ceremony. She'd been thinking about the 4 inches of skin beneath it. About what 7 years of iron had hidden. About the mark she'd had since birth that she had been covering, one way or another, since the night she was 12 years old, and someone had come to her village with torches and a list of names. The mark she had never, in all those years, shown to anyone. She pressed her crooked fingers together, watched the wedge of sky in the high window turn from gray to the particular pale gold of late afternoon. She had approximately 3 days to figure out what to do. She met him the next morning. Not in the throne room. She'd expected the throne room. Instead, one of the guards knocked at dawn and led her through the maze of corridors to the inner courtyard, where it turned out the Alpha King of Aldenmore took his breakfast outside when the weather permitted, sitting at a plain wooden table like any man who preferred air to ceremony. He was already there when they brought her. She had seen him on the wall the day before, but at distance. Up close, Dristan was. She adjusted her read of him, the way she always did when a first impression needed correcting. Larger than she'd estimated. Not the kind of large that comes from bulk, from shoulder to build he was lean, but the kind that comes from absolute stillness. The kind of man who takes up exactly the room he inhabits and no more, and by doing so makes every other person in the space feel like they are fidgeting. He was looking at her without expression. His eyes were the specific gray-green of river shallows in autumn, the color of water over dark stone, light coming through sideways. His unique physical detail, a burned scar on his right forearm, old and faded. Roughly the size and shape of a man's palm, the kind of scar a child makes when they grab something hot before they understand what hot means. He did not stand when they brought her in. He looked at her collar, then at her face. "Sit," he said. "I'd prefer to stand." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. I said sit, not for courtesy. There are things you'll want to eat before the next time you're likely to have a meal at a real table, and you'll need your legs under you when we're done. She sat. The food on the table was plainly prepared, nothing extravagant. Bread, a hard white cheese, sliced dried fruit that smelled of apple and something spiced. She didn't reach for any of it yet. "You're the tribute from Thornvale," he said. "I'm Nessa." "I know what you're called." He poured water into a cup and set it at her side of the table. Not wine, water, like he'd looked at her and correctly guessed what she'd actually want. "I also know Thornvale sent you because you're an orphan with no family to object, which makes you expendable to them, and therefore a low-risk political offering." She looked at him directly. "Are you expecting me to be hurt by that summary?" "I'm expecting you to already know it. I was establishing that I'm not going to pretend otherwise." A short silence. The courtyard had a fig tree in the corner, winter stripped of leaves, and a sparrow was working at something caught in its branches, a persistent, dry rustling that filled the quiet between their words. "What do you want?" she said. "Today?" He glanced at the burn scar on his own forearm and then away, quick, the single involuntary gesture she'd seen him make. "To know whether you're afraid of dogs." She blinked. That was not what she'd expected. "I have 3 in the Great Hall," he said. "They're poorly trained and they will jump on you, and if you're going to scream, it's better I know now." "I'm not afraid of dogs," he nodded. Pushed the bread toward her side of the table. She took a piece. What she hadn't expected, what she should later, much later, put her crooked fingers together and examine from every side, was that he was simply not performing. That was Driston. In every court, in every room she'd passed through in 22 years of trying to be invisible, she had learned to read the performance, who was playing strong, who was playing reasonable, who was playing kind. He wasn't playing anything. He was making observations and stating them, and passing the cheese and watching her with those gray-green eyes that gave nothing away. It was more unsettling than cruelty. On the second day, Lord Cavan found her in the corridor and walked beside her in that way men like him have, not quite threatening, close enough that the implication does the work, and said, in a light conversational tone, that the bonding rite was scheduled for dusk of the following day and that she should prepare herself. "For what, specifically?" she asked. He smiled. The scar pulled the left side of his mouth up slightly, asymmetrical. "The collar removal is ceremonial. The scent bond follows, if the alpha confirms. If he doesn't, a small pause, performed, you'd go back to Thornvale. A returned tribute is a considerable embarrassment to the council. For them or for me?" "Both." He said it like a kindness, "but more for you." He walked away. She stood in the corridor and pressed her fingers together and listened to his boots disappear around the corner. There was a question she had not yet answered. A question she had been circling for 3 days. The way you circle a fire that is both the only warmth available and the thing most likely to burn you. The bonding rite required the collar to come off. If she refused the rite, she went back to Thornvale, which would mean a different kind of exposure, a slower one. If she went through with it, the mark on her neck would be visible to every person in that ceremony. Every scholar who kept lineage scrolls, every wolf in the pack whose instincts were old enough to recognize an old bloodline. She needed a third option, and she had approximately 24 hours to find it. She didn't find it. This matters. I want you to understand that there was no clever plan, no last-minute strategy. What happened in the throne room the next evening, what cracked everything open, was not the result of Nessa's design. She is intelligent, and she had survived on her wits for a decade, and in this instance, her wits ran out, and the crack happened anyway. Some things break you open precisely because you couldn't stop them. The throne room at dusk held 40 people, which was more than she'd expected for what had been described to her as a ceremony. 40 pack wolves, in formal dress, dark wool and leather, the Aldenmore sigil on every breast, arranged along the walls in an order that told her immediately who had rank and who was simply present for the witnessing. The 2 scholars in gray stood to the left of the dais. Lord Cavan stood to the right. His expression was careful in a way that told her he had arranged this crowd with intent. This was not a small ceremony. This was a demonstration. She was brought in from the south door. The collar felt in that moment like it had gained weight, as if it knew what was about to happen. The room smelled of candle tallow and old stone, and the close-pressed warmth of the pack, and beneath it something she'd been trying not to name for 2 days. The particular scent of the alpha, pine and cold water, and something darker. Something like the smell of struck iron cooling after the forge. It had been following her around the keep, and she had been, restrainedly, with considerable effort, refusing to react to it. Driston stood at the center of the dais. No throne, He'd stepped off it, which was, she understood the custom for this right, equal ground. She appreciated the symbolism even as she mentally inventoried every exit from the room. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her collar, then at her face, the same way he had at breakfast 2 mornings ago, and said nothing. Lord Cavan spoke the formal words, old language, older than the kingdom, the pack tongue that every wolf knew in bone if not in ear. She had been taught enough of it in childhood to follow along. The collar of tribute, the moment of discernment, the alpha's choice, then the removal. Cavan reached for her collar with the key. She did not move. She kept her eyes on Dristan's face, not for reassurance, not because she wanted to be seen, because she needed to watch his expression in the moment the mark became visible. She needed 1/2 second of warning. The hinge opened. Cold air hit the skin of her neck, suddenly free, and she felt it the way you feel a window opened in a closed room. The shock of the new temperature, the exposure, the sense that whatever had been contained was now loose in the air. The collar came away. The silence happened first. Then it happened louder. One of the scholars made a sound. It wasn't words. It was the particular sharp intake of a man whose understanding of the world has just been restructured. Nessa watched Dristan's face. His expression did not change. Or rather, it changed in the way a man's expression changes when he is working very hard to ensure it doesn't change. His jaw set. The gray-green eyes dropped to her neck and stayed there for 2 full seconds. 3. His hands, which had been loose at his sides, closed slowly. "What is that mark?" Lord Cavan said, and it came out wrong. Not quite a question, not quite steady. "Birthmark," she said. "That is not a birthmark." He was already moving, crossing the dais, and she held still, because the worst thing you can do in a room full of wolves is run. "That is the Varith sigil." The name went through the room like a stone through still water, ripples invisible but felt. She watched the scholars' faces. She watched Lord Cavan's. She did not watch Dristan, because if she looked at him directly, she was going to lose her composure, and she could not afford that. "The Varith line is extinct," one of the scholars said. His name was Aldrich. She learned it later. He had ink-stained hands, both of them, and the particular ink smudge of a left-handed writer on his outer palm. The last queen died 20 years ago. Her children were. He stopped. "Were what?" Her voice was steady. She was very focused on keeping it that way. Aldrich looked at her like she was a problem in mathematics that had just given him a wrong answer. "Killed," he said, "with her." "We recorded their deaths," Dristan said very quietly. "Who recorded them?" Another silence. Different quality from the first. "The Thornvale Assembly," Cavan said, slowly. Like a man who has taken a step on ice and is now discovering how thick it is. The Assembly submitted the death records. He looked at Nessa. The careful expression was gone. Something underneath it, raw and unguarded. "You were in Thornvale's custody." "I was an orphan in their care," she said. "They told me so themselves." Dristan stepped off the dais. He moved through the crowd the way water moves. No hurry, absolute inevitability. And they parted for him, and he stopped in front of her. Close enough that she could smell the struck iron cooling scent of him properly, and this time she was not able to refuse the reaction. Her throat tightened. Her crooked fingers found each other. He looked at the mark on her neck for a long moment, then he looked at her face. "Nessa," he said, "just her name. Nothing after it." "Yes," she said. He reached out and turned to address the room. Not a dramatic gesture, barely a movement. But when he spoke, his voice filled the stone, the way the bell, in the keep tower, filled the courtyard at morning, absolute, unhurried, requiring no volume to be the most important sound in the space. "This ceremony is concluded. Clear the hall." Lord Cavan's head came up. "My lord, the succession implications. Clear the hall, Cavan." A beat, one beat, in which the entire weight of the room hung on whether Lord Cavan would push back. His eyes moved to Nessa, to the mark, to Dristan, and whatever he saw in Dristan's face decided him. He stepped back. The hall cleared. She and Dristan were alone in the throne room for the first time, and she realized she had miscalculated. She had planned for exposure. She had not planned for what came after exposure. For a man who did not reach for outrage or advantage or protocol, but simply looked at her in the emptied room, with candles guttering in the draft from the open doors, and said, "How long have you known?" Not a question. A precise instrument since I was 12. Your whole life, since the night I understood what it meant. He sat down on the dais step, not the throne, the step. Just down, suddenly, like a man who has been standing for a very long time and has decided the formality isn't worth it. She stays where she was. He looked at the floor between them. "The Thornvale Assembly," he said. "They sent you here in a collar with the mark covered." Yes. Did they know what they were covering? A long pause, her crooked fingers pressed together. "I don't know," she said, and it was the truth. One of the things that had kept her awake for 3 days, turning it over. Some of them must have known. Someone at the top of the assembly must have known, whether that meant they'd sent her here to dispose of her cleverly, or genuinely believed the mark was nothing. She hadn't solved that yet. "Sit down," Dristan said. "You keep saying that. You keep standing there like you're waiting to be dismissed." She sat down on the dais step. Not near him. Enough space that it wasn't proximity. He didn't seem to notice or mind. "Tell me," he said, "what you want, not what you think I need to hear, what you actually want." She looked at the candles, counted them without meaning to. 17. "I want the mark not to be real." Silence. "I've spent 10 years being invisible," she said. "Being invisible kept me alive." "The mark is the opposite of invisible." She looked at him. "Whatever it means to you politically, whatever you do with this, I want you to understand that I know exactly what being a lost queen costs. I know what it cost my family." His jaw set. He looked at the burned scar on his forearm. "Kevin will go to the assembly," he said. "Tonight. If I don't stop him, then stop him." That's not as simple. It never is. She heard something sharp in her own voice. "My lord, I've kept a secret for 10 years that would have given other people power and gotten me killed. I'm not under any illusions about how not simple this is." A long pause. Somewhere in the keep, one of his dogs barked twice and then went quiet. "You should have told me," he said, low. She looked at him. "When? Between the bread and the cheese? While your lord was implying I'd be returned to Thornvale like a faulty shipment." He looked at her. His expression did something she hadn't seen it do yet, something that wasn't calculation or authority, or the very still watchfulness he defaulted to. Something underneath, briefly visible. He looked it away. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "there will be a council, whether I want one or not." He stood up. "You should be there. Will you protect me?" He stopped. She had not meant to ask it that directly. It cost her something. The directness of it. She could feel the weight of the question as it left her mouth. She pressed her fingers together. He didn't answer immediately. He reached down and picked up the collar from the floor where Kevin had set it. He turned it in his hands. "The Vareth line," he said, "were the rightful rulers of these territories before the Assembly's arrangement." He set the collar on the dais. "You walked in here in iron, wearing their sigil. And you were sent by the people who, one way or another, were there when your family died." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I'll protect you." He walked out. She sat on the dais step for a long time after, in the quiet. She pressed her crooked fingers together. She thought about how a man who had just had his political world fundamentally restructured had sat down on a step and asked her what she actually wanted before asking anything else. She thought about that. She was very careful not to think about it too much. Here is where I have to tell you something. Here is where I have to pull back a little from Nessa's perspective and tell you what she didn't know yet. What the viewer needs to know for what comes next to land properly. The Vareth sigil wasn't just a royal marking. It was, in the old pack law, the law that predated the assembly by 4 centuries, that still lived in the lineage scrolls that Aldrich kept in the gray tower, a binding sigil. Not a bonding mark, not like the scent bond of mates, but something older and rarer. A queen right, the scrolls called it. An alpha king who stood beside a Vaerith heir and declared her under his protection wasn't just making a political statement. He was, under the old law, declaring fealty. Aldrich knew this. He had gone pale in the throne room at a very specific moment, not when the mark was revealed, but 3 seconds later, when Destined stepped off the dais and moved through the crowd toward her. He hadn't known whether Destined knew the old law, whether the Alpha had understood, in that moment, what his own movement meant. Aldrich had kept that to himself. He was a man who collected information the way others collect objects, and he had learned, in his years at Aldenmore, that the information you don't give away is frequently more valuable than the information you do. Nessa did not know any of this yet. She knew the old law existed. She did not know the extent of it. She had never been taught it, had been separated from everyone who might have taught it when she was 12 years old and the torches came. She knew the mark was dangerous. She didn't know it was quite that dangerous. This is important. Hold it. The council met in the morning in the East Room, where a long oak table held 12 chairs, and the light came through arrow slits and made thin, bright lines on the floor. She counted the chairs before people sat in them. 12. Destined at the head. Khyven to his right. Aldrich in the scholar's seat. 3 senior pack wolves. Sorvain, a woman with her gray hair worn in a tight braid and hands that didn't stop moving. Fingers always finding some small object to turn over. Brethen, enormous and soft-spoken with a jaw scar that wasn't cosmetic in the way Khyven's was, that went somewhere private. And young Eric, barely older than Nessa, freckled across the bridge of his nose in a pattern like scattered stars, who kept looking at her, and then at the table as if she were a son he wasn't supposed to look at directly. 3 assembly representatives who had been at the keep already for reasons Nessa noted and set aside. 2 guards by the door, and her. Khyven had not gone to the assembly in the night. She didn't know why, hadn't expected Destined to successfully prevent it. But he had not gone, and he sat at the table with his scar-pulled expression arranged into something that was almost neutrality. Almost. Destined did not look at her when she came in, he looked at the table. He had a cup of something at his right hand that he didn't drink. He looked like a man who had not slept. She took the seat farthest from him and waited. The council was, she could only call it controlled chaos. Controlled by Destined, chaos from every other corner. The assembly representatives were the worst of it. One of them, a man called Edric Vane, who was thin in the way that suggests energy rather than deprivation, with a mouth that moved quickly, and eyes that moved quicker, established within approximately 3 minutes that he intended to dispute the authenticity of the mark. He was not subtle about it. The Vaerith line's markers are documented, he said, tapping the table with one finger in a rapid rhythm. There are known fakes in circulation. We have no verification. The scholar's scrolls are the verification, Aldrich said, mildly. The scholar's scrolls document what was seen, not what was real. Then what they saw, Aldrich said, was a birthmark consistent in every particular with the royal Vaerith sigil, on a woman who arrived here from Thornvale in a collar that was put on her by the Thornvale Assembly. A pause. Ink-stained hands folded on the table. Which raises questions I think this council might like to address. Edric Vane's rapid finger-tapping stopped. Just for a moment, Sorvain said, without looking up from the small stone she was turning over in her fingers. Who put the collar on her? Silence. Who put the collar on her? She said again, to no one in particular. Who made that decision? Who had access to her neck? And whether whoever did, she looked up and her eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of winter sky, knew what they were covering. Nessa felt the room go tense in a specific way. The kind of tension that happens when everyone in a space is calculating at the same time. The assembly. Khyven said carefully. Uz's standard tribute collars. There would have been no. She's been in assembly care since she was 12. Sorvain's voice was pleasant. The tribute collar was put on 3 weeks ago, for the journey. What was on her neck before that? Nessa said, a scarf. Every head in the room turned to her. Not always the same one, she said, but something. Since I was 12, I've kept it covered. Along quiet. The thin lines of light from the arrow slits had moved, imperceptibly, since they'd all sat down, the morning proceeding around the conversation without caring about it. Why? Driston said. And here is where it happened. Here is where the floor changed shape under all of them. Because, she said, the last time someone saw it, they came to my village with torches and killed my family. No one spoke. I was 12 years old, she said. My mother had just shown the mark to 2 men she trusted. Because there was a succession dispute in the north and she thought, she had been told, that the Varith line might be recognized, restored. She kept her voice level. It cost her. 3 nights later, she stopped. I learned to keep my neck covered after that. She had known what the mark was for as long as she could remember. Her mother had told her, quietly, with the gravity of something passed down through generations under extreme caution. The Varith queens had not been a legend in their household. They had been a responsibility. A thing you were, that you never said aloud, that you carried very carefully in the dark. She had been carrying it alone for 10 years. The assumption the room had been working with, that she hadn't known, that she was an unwitting vessel, a passive discovery. Cracked open, completely and quietly, like a fault line that had been waiting. Edric Vane's expression shifted. She watched it, watched him recalculate, watched whatever plan he'd come into the room with get revised in real time. He was good at it. Not fast enough. Driston had gone very still. He looked at her with the gray-green eyes, and this time he didn't look away. She held his gaze. You walked in here knowing, he said. Yes, into a bonding rite. Knowing that removing the collar would reveal. I had 3 days to find another way. Her crooked fingers under the table. I didn't find one, he swallowed. Once. Then again, deliberate, like a man swallowing something that didn't go down smoothly. She watched the muscle in his jaw work and understood, with sudden precision, that he was not angry. He was. Something else. Something she would need more information to name. The council will recess, he said. He stood up. 1 hour. He found her in the corridor 10 minutes later, and she almost walked past him. Which says something about where her mind was. She was moving fast, thinking faster, trying to calculate the new shape of things, and failing to notice the Alpha King stepping out of a doorway until he was directly in her path. She stopped. He stopped. You could have told me, he said. Lower than the council room, private. Last night. You asked what I wanted, I answered. You didn't answer this. She looked up at him. This close, the struck iron scent was. She pressed her fingers together. What would you have done if I had? If I'd sat on that step and said, by the way, I knew what the mark was. I've known since childhood. I walked into your bonding rite with full awareness of what removing that collar would expose. A pause. Differently, he said. How? He didn't answer. She watched him not answer and understood that it wasn't evasion. He genuinely didn't know. He had not worked it out yet. Then you understand, she said, why I didn't. He put his hand on the corridor wall, not near her, just. A gesture, she thought, of the kind men make when they are slightly unmoored and need something solid. His burned scar was visible where his sleeve had pulled back. She did not look at it. There are people in that room, he said, who were in the assembly circle 20 years ago. I know. Edric Vane was. I know. She met his eyes. I counted them. When I sat down before anyone spoke, I know which 3 I need to watch. Another pause. This one longer. Tell me, he said. Careful. What you need from me. She pressed her fingers together so hard the crooked ones ached. I need you to understand that I did not come here looking for a crown. I don't want what that mark means. I have spent every year since I was 12 trying to exist without it. She held her voice level. I need you to understand that before you do anything with this, that treats it as an asset. He looked at her for a long time. Is that what you think I'd do? I don't know you well enough to know what you'd do. Then we have that in common, he said, and for a moment, one moment, something moved in his face that was not calculation and not authority, and was not the careful nothing he defaulted to. I don't know you well enough to know what you'd do either. She held his gaze. He pushed off the wall and walked back toward the council room. She followed, a step behind, and felt, for the first time since she'd boarded the barge at Thornvale, something shift in her chest that was not just the pressure of carriage-aid weight. She pressed her crooked fingers together and refused to examine it. The council recessed for 3 hours, not 1, and by the time they reconvened, the shape of things had changed. Sorvain had, in the interim, sent a message to a woman named Tessa Graves in the Eastern District, a name Nessa knew, distantly, as a loyalist elder, one of the families who had kept faith with the Verith line. She didn't know how Sorvain had that contact. Sorvain's small stone moved faster between her fingers than before, which Nessa read as tension, though nothing in her face showed it. Brethen had quietly taken both guards from the south door and added 3 more at the outer gate, which told Nessa that he had reached the same conclusion she had. Somebody was going to send a message out of the keep, and it was better to know who and when. Edric Vane had spent the recess in his room with the door closed. She knew because she had walked past it twice. The council was slower the second time, more careful. A great deal of formal language was deployed, and formal language in councils of this kind is, she had learned, the way people buy time while they work out what they actually want. She sat and listened and counted and waited. What emerged, slowly, like something being hauled up from depth, was this. There were 2 positions taking shape. Dristan's position, stated simply, was that the mark was a question of pack law and territory law, and needed to be examined without external interference. Caven's position, stated carefully, was that the Assembly had legitimate jurisdiction and should be notified. Edric Vane's position, stated through implication, was that the mark's authenticity was still unverified, and the whole matter was preliminary. What no one said aloud, what Nessa could see forming in the room like weather, was the real division between those who were genuinely uncertain what the right path was, and those who already knew what they wanted to happen and were constructing reasoning backward from the destination. She knew which one's Edric Vane was. She thought she knew which one's Caven was. She was not entirely sure about Caven. On the 3rd day, because these things, she had learned, always take exactly long enough to feel like standing on a fault line, the word got out. Not through Vane, not through Caven, through one of the Assembly representatives who had been at the keep before her arrival, a quiet man named Osbert who had not spoken once in either council session, and who was, she understood too late, exactly the kind of man you needed to watch precisely because they didn't speak. Osbert left the keep at dawn, on a horse headed east. Brethen's guards at the outer gate let him through because he had the proper documentation, and there were, technically, no orders preventing Assembly representatives from leaving. By the time Nessa heard about it, from Eric, who had seen the gate log and come to find her with his freckled face, set in a careful blankness that didn't quite disguise the alarm underneath, it was an hour past sunrise. She went to Dristan. He was in the practice yard, alone, which was, she recognized, how he processed things. Motion, physical engagement, the yard rather than the throne room. He had a training sword and was working through forms that were too precise and too hard for simple exercise. There was sweat on the back of his neck. She stood at the gate and said his name. He turned. Osbert rode east this morning, she said. A pause in which he assessed the implications. She watched him do it, watched the gray-green eyes move through the calculation. Then he drove the practice sword into the sand and walked toward her. Who did he go to? That depends on who the assembly has been in contact with in the East. She looked at him. I have a partial list, from before I left Thornvale. There were 2 contacts in the Eastern Territories who were discussed in the Assembly House when they thought I couldn't hear. One is political, one is, she paused. Not. Tell me. Lord Fenn of the Eastern Ridge, and a man called Orvain. Dresden went very still. Orvain is dead. His people aren't. The name meant something specific to him. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the particular way he became more still rather than more agitated. Orvain was, she gathered from what she knew and from his reaction, not a man who had died the way men die of age or illness. He was a name attached to a kind of organized violence that didn't stop with its originator. How long? He said. If Osbert rode at dawn at speed, and that horse was fresh, I saw it. 2 days. Maybe less if Fenn sends someone who knows the mountain roads. He looked at her, not through any of the careful management of expression he'd been using in the council room. Directly. You told me you've been surviving on staying invisible for 10 years. That the mark is the opposite of that. Yes, and now Osbert. Now it doesn't matter, she said, and she heard in her own voice something she hadn't put there deliberately. Not resignation, not quite. Something under resignation, something that had been true for 10 years and was simply, for the first time, audible. I'm visible. Whatever I do next, I'm visible. I can't go back to the scarf. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the yard, pulled the practice sword out of the sand, and said, Find Sorvain, tell her to bring Tessa Graves here, whatever it costs. He paused. Tell Eirik to go to the Eastern Archives in town, the old ones, the pre-assembly records. I want the Vayrith succession documents. He looked over his shoulder. Not for me. For you. You should know what you're carrying. She opened her mouth, closed it. Go, he said, not harshly. She went, and stopped once halfway across the yard, because something about that, you should know what you're carrying, had hit a place in her chest that wasn't prepared to be hit, and she needed a moment. One moment. Then she pressed her fingers together and walked on. Tessa Graves arrived the next morning on a roan mare that had been ridden hard, with 2 people Nessa didn't know flanking her, and a leather satchel on her back, that she held with both arms in the way people hold something they'd die rather than drop. Tessa Graves was old, not fragile old, but the other kind, the kind that has calcified into something dense and capable of applying enormous pressure. She had a streak of white in her dark hair that ran from her left temple straight back, exact and deliberate-looking as a lightning strike. Her eyes found Nessa the moment she rode through the gate. She didn't stop for Driston. She stopped for Nessa. She looked at the mark on her neck. Nessa's neck had been bare since the ceremony, no scarf. The decision made in the practice yard without quite meaning to. And Tessa Graves's expression did something that Nessa was not prepared for. She wept. Briefly, completely. Like a woman who has been holding something in a closed hand for 20 years, and has just been told she can open it. Then she stopped and wiped her face with the back of her hand and said in a voice that did not waver, Your mother's eyes were gray, yours are almost exactly the same. Nessa pressed her fingers together, very hard. You knew her, she said. I knew your grandmother better. Tessa swung off the horse and handed the reins to one of her people without looking at them. I was her handmaiden. For 11 years. She looked at Nessa with the clear, weighing attention of someone who has been waiting for this specific moment and is not going to waste it on sentiment. Your grandmother passed the succession training to your mother, and your mother passed what she could to you, I assume, before. She stopped. Before, Nessa agreed. Tessa Graves opened the leather satchel. Inside, papers, documents, old ones, the kind of old that means you handle them carefully and don't put them in sunlight any longer than necessary. She set them on the courtyard wall, in the shade, and spread the first one with the efficient care of someone who has done it many times. Nessa looked at it and saw at the top in the formal lettering of the old court the Varith succession record, names, generations, and at the bottom, below her mother's name, in a hand she didn't know, someone who had written it after, who had added it to the document from outside, who had known that the record needed completing even if the people in it were supposed to be dead. Her own name, Nessa, below it in the same hand, confirmed survivor, location unknown, mark intact. Somebody had been looking for her. For years. Somebody had known she existed, had confirmed she'd survived, had been trying to find her, and she had been so busy being invisible that she hadn't known to look back. She pressed her fingers together so hard they ached. "Who wrote this?" she said. Tessa Graves smiled, and it was a sad smile, the kind that has layers. Someone who never stopped believing the line survived. She folded her hands over the satchel. Someone who recently heard that a tribute bride with a covered neck arrived in Aldenmore wearing an assembly collar. Nessa looked up. "Sorvain reached you before I was brought in, 3 days before." Tessa's pale eyes were steady. "I came as soon as I could safely travel. 3 days before. Before the ceremony. Before the reveal." Sorvain had known, or guessed, before the collar came off in the throne room, and she had kept that information in her own pocket, in her cold and clever way, until she could be certain. Nessa filed this. She did not know yet whether to trust it. "There are people coming," she said. "People who want the old line to stay dead." "There are always people coming," Tessa said. "The question is whether you're going to be standing somewhere defensible when they arrive." She looked at the mark on Nessa's neck with an expression that was not reverence exactly, but something adjacent. "The question is whether you've decided to stop being invisible." Nessa looked at the document. At her own name in a stranger's hand, at the words, "Confirmed survivor, mark intact." She thought about the 12 years of scarves. The careful walk down every corridor she'd inhabited, the inventory of exits, the performance of ordinariness so practiced it, had become the only self she remembered being. The years of being, not quite nobody, but not quite anyone, and choosing the not anyone, because the someone underneath was a woman with a target on her neck. She thought about Driston saying, "You should know what you're carrying. What does the old law say?" She said to Tessa, quietly. "About a Varith queen in the territory of an alpha who declares her under his protection." Tessa's expression shifted. She looked at Nessa with something that recalibrated, like a measuring instrument that has just been given more precise data. "Where did you hear about that provision?" "I didn't hear it anywhere. I just noticed that Aldrich went pale when Driston walked across the throne room." A long pause. "The old law," Tessa said, "is not ambiguous on this point." She picked up the satchel and held it under her arm. "An alpha king who declares a Varith queen under his protection is bound to it, not by choice. By the oldest pack law there is. It is," she paused, choosing her word, "binding. On both sides." Nessa said, "On both sides." Another silence. A bird crossed the courtyard overhead, fast and purposeful, its shadow flicking across the documents on the wall. "He didn't know," Nessa said. It wasn't a question. Almost certainly not. She thought about him saying yes when she asked if he would protect her. One simple word in the empty throne room, the collar on the step beside him. He had not known what it committed him to. He had said it anyway. She picked up the documents carefully and held them to her chest and walked back into the keep. The convergence happened at dawn of the following day, and it came from both directions at once, which is rarely how people expect these things to arrive. They expect an enemy to come from outside, not for the inside to shift at the same moment. From the east, riders, 9 of them, arriving at the keep's outer gate in the half-light with a formal writ from Lord Fenn citing, cleverly. She gave them credit, a territorial dispute that required the Alpha King's immediate attention. The writ was real, the dispute invented, but the riders were not Fenn's men. She couldn't have told you exactly how she knew. She knew. Brethen held them at the outer gate. Eric came to tell Nessa at a near run. From the inside, Edric Vane. He had moved overnight. She didn't know how she'd miscalculated him. She would think about that later, would press her crooked fingers together in the dark, and go over every moment of every council session and find the place where she'd filed him as contained, and hadn't checked back. He had, in the night, gotten a message to someone within the keep. She didn't know who yet. And the result was that when Dryston went to the East Corridor to deal with the gate situation, Khyven found Nessa alone in the corridor near the East Room with 3 men she hadn't seen before. They were not aggressive. This was the clever part. They simply stood in a configuration that blocked the corridor ahead and made retreat complicated. And Khyven said in his pleasantly flat voice that it would be easier for everyone if she came with them to the East Room for a conversation. "Whose conversation?" she said. "Vane's." She looked at the 3 men, calculated, made a decision that cost her. She knew it as she made it, because the sensible option was to call out, raise noise, draw attention, and the thing that stopped her was the same instinct that had kept her alive for 10 years. The one that said, "Do not make noise when you don't know the shape of the room." She went with them. The East Room held Edric Vane, one of the assembly representatives she'd identified as Vane's ally, and a woman she didn't know. The kind of not knowing that felt different from ordinary ignorance, that felt like a gap someone had deliberately cut. The woman was small, brown-haired, with a stillness that reminded Nessa uncomfortably of Driston's kind of stillness, the wait-in-the-room kind. Vane said, "The Assembly wants to offer you something. I'm sure they do. A settlement." He leaned on the table with both palms. "The mark is real, we're not disputing it. But the succession law requires more than a mark. It requires recognition, formal recognition, from the Pack Lords, from the Alpha Kings of the territories." He paused. "That recognition can be prevented, or it can be structured, in a way that serves multiple interests, including the interests of the people who killed my family. A silence. The Assembly," he said, "did not order that, whatever you may believe." "What I believe," she said, "and what can be proven are 2 different things, and you know that." She looked at him steadily. "What you're offering is the choice between quiet cooperation and the less comfortable alternative. Which means you need something from me. Which means I have more leverage than I walked in here with." Vane's quick eyes moved, recalculated. The woman with the Driston stillness said, from the corner, in a low voice, "The mark is a queen right. If the Alpha King claims the old law fealty, publicly, in front of Pack witnesses, it's irrevocable. The succession is sealed. No assembly writ overrides it." Nessa looked at her. "You're not with them." "No." The woman held her gaze. "My name is Alith. I was your grandmother's second cousin's daughter. I have been looking for you for 11 years. She looked at Vane with an expression that was not hostile, simply absolute, "and I will not be quiet about what I found." Edric Vane picked up his papers from the table and straightened them with sharp, specific movements. "This is premature," he said. "The Alpha has not made any declaration." The door opened. Driston stood in it. Behind him, Sarvain, Tessa Graves, Brethen. Eric in the corridor, his freckled face very still. They had dealt with the gate. The riders were being held, and someone had told them where she was. She would find out later that it was Eric who had run to the practice yard and found Driston and said, in his even young voice, that Khyven had taken her to the East Room. Driston looked at the room. At Vane. At Khyven. At Nessa. His expression was, "She found it," the one word, settled. Like a man who has stopped deliberating and arrived somewhere, and the arriving is visible in the quality of his stillness. He crossed to her, stood beside her, not in front of her, not behind, beside, turned to face the room. "Get out," he said to Vane. "My lord, the Assembly's position, get out." Khyven said quietly. "The riders at the gate. If they carry Orvain's commission, they do." Dristan looked at him. That's why Brethon's people are with them. Caven's jaw worked. Something moved in his face, not calculation this time. Something underneath it. He looked at Nessa. She had never seen him look at her without the professional distance, and she wasn't sure what was behind his eyes now. It wasn't precisely guilt. It was something adjacent. Something that had been present all along, she thought, that he had been covering as efficiently as she'd been covering the mark on her neck. I have served this keep for 15 years, Caven said. I know. Dristan's voice was even, not cold, even, which is why you're going to step back and let me handle this. A pause that lasted several seconds longer than comfortable. Then Caven stepped back. He didn't leave the room, not yet, but he moved aside, and the movement was, in its way, the most significant thing he had done in the entire series of events. Edric Vane left. The assembly representative followed him. The 3 men in the corridor were, she heard later, simply asked to leave by Sorvain in a tone of voice that made the asking feel optional, and then feel not optional. Alith stayed. Nessa looked at her across the room, at the woman who had spent 11 years looking for her, and found her, finally, in a convergence that had required things to break open first. Dristan turned to Nessa. Beside her, she had said. He was still beside her, not positioned in front, not requiring her to step behind him. Beside. Are you hurt? He said. No. He looked at her and did not look away. I should have secured the corridor last night. When I knew Vane was, he stopped. That was mine. I miscalculated him. She blinked. She had not expected that. So did I. You had less to work with. He glanced at Alith. She's who Tessa contacted. She said. Nessa looked at him. You know the old law. A pause. Aldrich told me this morning, he said, when I pressed him about why he'd gone pale in the throne room. What did he say exactly? Dristan looked at the burn scar on his forearm. He said that when I moved across the throne room I had. Another pause, effectively begun the process. Under the old law. Without knowing, and if you complete it. His jaw set. He looked at her directly. It's not a trap. I want you to understand that before anything else. His voice was low. The private register, not the council register. I said I would protect you before I knew what the law said. I'm not completing it because the law compels me. She looked at him, her crooked fingers pressed together. She thought about trust, which was a word she had taught herself to think of as a transaction rather than a state. You gave it in small amounts and waited to see what came back. She had been doing it with him for 5 days, and the returns had been, she couldn't pretend otherwise. Consistent. Why are you completing it? She said. He looked at her for a long, level moment. Because you walked into my bonding rite in iron and stood there with your chin level. Because you counted the guards on the wall before you'd even gotten off the barge. Because you sat on the dais step in an empty room and told me the truth before you told me anything useful. A pause. Because you asked me to see you before you asked me to protect you. She held his gaze. The mark is a problem, she said. Yes, the loyalists and the assembly and Orvain's people. Yes, and there will be others. There will always be others where this mark is concerned. Yes, he said it without flinching. I know. She looked at him, at the burn scar, at the gray-green eyes that gave things away now. If you knew how to read them, if you'd been paying attention for 5 days. At the man who had sat down on a step when he didn't have to, and asked her what she actually wanted. She pressed her fingers together one more time. Let them go. Then show me the old law, she said. I want to read it myself, before anything. The thing that moved in his face, then, she had a name for it now. She had been collecting the language for it since that first morning in the courtyard, the first time he'd pushed the bread toward her. She had a name, and she was not going to say it yet. But she knew it. He said, Come with me. The declaration happened in the great hall. Not in the throne room. She had specified this, and he had agreed without discussion, which she took as evidence that he understood why. The throne room carried too much of the ceremony that had started everything. The great hall was older, plainer, the stone black with centuries of firelight, and the 3 dogs asleep in front of the hearth. The way dogs sleep when the humans around them have finally stopped being alarming. The hall held Sorvain and Brethon and Eric and Aldrich and Tessa Graves and Aleth and a handful of senior pack wolves, all of them witnesses under the old law. Caven was there, standing to one side. She hadn't expected that. Aldrich read the provision from the scroll in the old language first, then the common tongue. It was shorter than she'd expected. The old laws were always shorter than their consequences. Destined stood in front of her and said the words. She did not reach for his hands. He did not reach for hers. They stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the struck iron scent of him that she had stopped pretending she wasn't aware of. And he said the words of the old law in a steady voice, with his gray-green eyes on her face. And she felt the words land the way things land when they are irrevocable, not with drama, but with weight. The particular dense weight of something that has shifted permanently. When he finished, she felt the change. She couldn't have described it in a way that would satisfy someone who wanted mechanics. She felt it in her throat, at the place where the collar had been, the exposed skin that had been bare to air for 6 days now and was still, sometimes, startled by its own nakedness. A warmth. Not the scent bond, that was something else. Something that would take time, that they both knew. This was the older thing. The queen right, the old law, settling in like a key into a lock that had been waiting for it. The hall was quiet. The dog slept. She looked at Destined. "Well," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Well, that's very irrevocable." "It is." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the hall, at Sorvain, whose stone had gone still in her hand, at Eric, whose expression had dropped the careful blankness entirely, at Tessa Graves, who was looking at her with the particular expression of someone who has been proven right after a very long time of being told they were wrong, at Caven, who was looking at the floor. She could leave it there. He'd stepped back in the east room. He had not, in the end, been the worst of them, or not entirely. But she looked at him and thought about the tribute collar and the barge, and the ride to Thornvale and the 15 years he'd spent in this keep, serving it, watching it, knowing what the assembly was, and chose. She crossed to him. He didn't look up until she stopped in front of him. Then he did. "The collar," she said, quietly. "Only the 2 of them in the sound of it. You put it on me." He said nothing. "You know the mark that was underneath it." A pause, a long one. The kind where you watch someone decide who they're going to be. "I suspected," he said, low. I told myself I wasn't certain." "Were you?" His jaw tightened. The scar pulled his eye into its permanent squint. "Yes." She looked at him. She thought about anger, which she had in plenty, which she had carried for years in a compact form. The way you carry things that need to be small, so they don't take up all the air. "You'll want to think," she said, "about what you do with that, going forward." He held her gaze. And then, it was not elegant, and she would not call it groveling, which is a word that requires a performance, and this was not a performance. Caven of Aldenmore bowed. Not the formal bow of a court official. The other kind. The kind that requires something to be put down first. She let it stand. She turned back to the room. Destined was watching her. He had watched her cross to Caven and had not intervened, and was now watching her return with an expression that was, she found it, proud. Not possesses proud. The other kind. The kind that recognizes something rather than claims it. She stopped beside him again. Her crooked fingers found each other, and she looked at them for a moment. Those 2 bent, leaning fingers, the old injury, the old habit. Then she looked up. "Tell me about the East situation," she said. He looked at her for 1 moment longer than necessary. Then he turned to Brethon and began. The riders at the gate were held for 2 days. Orvain's commission was, it turned out, genuine in some details and fabricated in others. The forgery was good enough that it took Aldrich and Eric both to unpick it. working in the archive by candlelight until Irik's freckled face had developed the particular expression of a young man who has been awake too long and is sustained only by indignation. The forgery mattered because it demonstrated not just intent but organization. Whoever had sent those riders had resources, contacts within the assembly's formal structure, access to seals that were supposed to be secured. She worked through the evidence with Aldrich and Irik herself, sitting at the archive table with the documents spread out, pressing her fingers together over the pieces that didn't fit yet. Destined came in twice. The first time he looked at the spread of documents, looked at her, and left without saying anything. The second time he brought her a cup of something hot that smelled of herbs and set it at her elbow and said, "You haven't eaten. I've been 3 hours." He looked at the documents, then at her. "I'm going to need you functional." "I'm functional." He looked at the crooked fingers pressed together so hard the skin had gone white. Said nothing. Set a piece of bread beside the cup and left. She ate the bread. She was not going to acknowledge anything about that. Lord Fen in the east went quiet, which was more alarming than noise would have been. Sorvain sent 2 contacts to find out what quiet meant. They reported back in 4 days. Fen had received a message that the situation at Aldenmoor had resolved under the old law, and that the legal complexity of contesting it was not something his resources extended to. He had, apparently, decided that he had never been particularly interested in the matter. This was a lie, but a useful one. The kind that gives everyone a path back from a conflict they've already half committed to. Aleth stayed. This was something Nessa had not anticipated. She'd expected Tessa Graves's people to be temporary, to come with the crisis and leave when it settled. But Aleth had been looking for her for 11 years and seemed to feel no particular urgency about leaving now that she'd found her. She was, it turned out, one of the people who had written the succession document, the ink in her name identical to the ink of confirmed survivor, mark intact. She had her own archive of Vareth records, carried in a second satchel that she produced from her horse's saddlebag, and brought to the archive room with the careful reverence of someone carrying a life's work. And she sat across the table from Nessa and spread papers out and said, simply, "Let's start from the beginning." The beginning was her grandmother, a woman named Vera, who had been, from everything Aleth described, a woman of formidable patience and considerable anger kept under very precise control, who had held her court together for 23 years through a combination of political clarity and the kind of loyalty you earn rather than inherit, who had known, toward the end, that the assembly was encroaching and had made preparations. "What kind of preparations?" Nessa asked. Aleth folded her hands on the table. "You," she said, spreading the children out. Different households, different names, different regions. If the worst happened, she paused. If the line was struck, not all of it would fall at once. Nessa sat with this for a moment. The idea that she had been, from birth, a contingency. Her mother had carried her queen right, the way you carry insurance, the way you carry the document you hope you never need, and had passed it to Nessa with that same gravity. "You are this. Don't let anyone see. If the worst happens, survive." The worst had happened. She had survived. For 10 years, she had thought of her survival as an accident, as luck, as the particular chaos of that night giving her a window she'd barely managed to climb through. But it hadn't been luck. It had been design. Her grandmother's design, long before her grandmother ever saw the worst coming. She pressed her fingers together. "How many others?" she said. "Are there others who survived?" The spreading out. Aleth looked at her with an expression that carried multiple things and was choosing which of them to say. "We believe you're the last." A pause. "Believe," she said. "We've found no others. In 11 years. Aleth held her gaze. "You're it, Nessa, the entire line." She sat very still with this. The fire in the archive room was small and not doing very much, and the chill of the stone walls made itself known in the particular way it does in old places. Not a wind, just a presence. a cold that has been here longer than any of the people in it. That's, she started, stopped. A great deal of weight, Aleth said. Yes, I know. Aleth reached across the table and put one hand briefly over Nessa's crooked pear. Then she pulled back. Your grandmother carried it her whole life and never bent under it. Her daughter did the same, for the years she had. She looked at the documents. It's possible to carry it without being crushed. Nessa looked at the fire, thought. Possible, yes. Certain, no. She thought about what it meant to be the only one, the single point of survivorship. Every decision she made from here was the decision of the entire line. Every failure was the failure of a dynasty. The crown her grandmother had worn was now. She was understanding this slowly, with the particular quality of understanding that comes when you already knew something in your bones and your mind is now catching up. Her crown, not a future crown, not a hypothetical one, the immediate weight of it. She thought about why she'd hidden it, and understood that she had been right to hide it, and understood also that the hiding was done, and that the person she was now, this woman on this particular morning, in this archive room, with these documents and this small fire, was going to have to decide who she was going to be from this point forward. She thought about Dristan and the bread and the cup of herbs and the word beside. She thought, aching longing under the dread of a birthright that kills. She thought, yes, exactly that. She found him at the wall walk. Late evening, the sky behind him, the specific violet that comes before full dark. The horizon still holding a line of amber where the sun had been. He was standing in almost exactly the same position she'd seen him on the first day, slightly apart, looking at the horizon, close to the drop. She stopped beside him. Not behind, not at a careful neutral distance. Beside. He didn't turn. He had heard her coming. She knew. Alpha senses, the pack awareness that meant she would never successfully surprise him, which was something she had mixed feelings about, and had decided to set aside for now. Aleth told me about the line, she said, that I'm the last. I know. He had a way of saying I know that was not dismissive. It was the way of someone who has been thinking about the same thing and is acknowledging that they're in the same room with it. The crown, she said. What it means. The queen right, the old law. People are going to want things from it. She looked at the horizon. People are going to want things from me. Yes. I don't want a crown. A pause. I know, he said. What I want. She stopped, pressed her fingers together. The two crooked ones found each other. What I've wanted for 10 years is to not be a thing that other people make claims on. To be a person. Without the weight of a dynasty. She looked at him. I know that's not available to me anymore. He turned his head to look at her. The amber line of the horizon was behind him now, and his face was in shadow. And she couldn't read his expression precisely, only its quality. The quality of someone who is paying the kind of attention that is itself a form of respect. What is available to you, he said quietly, is a choice about what to do with it. I know. She held his gaze. I'm still working out what that is. You have time. Do I? She looked at the violet sky. Orvain's people aren't finished. The assembly isn't finished. The moment the succession is formalized, officially, publicly, there will be others. Yes. He turned back to the horizon. I'll still be here. She looked at his profile. The burn scar on his arm. The precise quality of his stillness, the weight in the room kind. The kind that had felt threatening on the first day, and felt now like something else. Something she had a name for, and was not going to say out loud yet. You didn't know what the old law would do, she said. When you said you'd protect me. No. And when you found out. He looked at her. I was angry. Direct, she appreciated that. For about an hour. At Aldrich, partly, for not telling me immediately. At myself. For moving across the throne room without. He stopped. But anger at a thing that's already happened is not particularly useful, and I decided that what mattered was whether I would have said something different if I'd known. A pause. I wouldn't have. She held his gaze. You should know, she said. that I'm difficult. The corner of his mouth. I have gathered that. I'm not going to be, I'm not a tribute bride, and I'm not going to behave like one, and whatever the court expects, Nessa. She stopped. I know, he said. Simple, calm. That's why. She held his gaze for a long moment. The violet had deepened to blue behind him, and the first star was out, the bright one, the one that comes first every evening in that specific position above the eastern ridge. She looked at it, then at him. Then, for once, without pressing her fingers together, without cataloging the exits, without calculating the angle of the thing, she let herself feel the full weight of what was there, between them, in the cold air on the wall, walk with the light going and the dogs somewhere below them in the keep, and the world outside the wall that was not finished trying to reach her. She let it sit. She did not name it. She did not reach for it, but she let it sit. The formal succession documents were filed with the Pack Lord Council 3 weeks later. Aldrich carried them himself, with Aleph, and returned with 4 official seals and the particular expression of a man who has witnessed a piece of history and is trying not to make it obvious that he's writing it down in his head. Edric Vane had left. The assembly did not formally contest the succession. What happened in the upper levels of the assembly in the weeks after? What conversations took place? What decisions were made? What people decided it was no longer in their interest to pursue? Nessa was not fully informed of, and this was partly because the information wasn't available, and partly because she had decided there were things she needed not to carry right now, things other people could carry while she worked out the shape of who she was going to be. Caven stayed. She had not expected this either. He resumed his duties with a care that was different from his previous careful efficiency, smaller, more inward. The quality of a man who has set something down and is finding out what he weighs without it. She did not seek him out, and he did not seek her out. They existed in the same keep with the particular restraint of 2 people who have said what needed saying and are letting it settle. She learned the old law. All of it. Sat in the archive with Aldrich for 5 days while he walked her through 4 centuries of legal provisions, and she asked questions that had him reaching for scrolls he hadn't touched in years with the suppressed excitement of a scholar who has finally been asked something worth answering. She was not planning to use the law as a weapon. She was planning to know it the way she knew every building she'd ever been in, exit by exit, wall by wall. She learned the Varith succession documents. She read her grandmother's name with the weight that a name carries when it is both a history and a mirror, and she looked at her own name at the bottom and she thought, confirmed survivor. Mark intact. She was a survivor. The mark was intact. What she made of those 2 facts was now entirely hers to determine. Here is where I have to tell you something directly. I have been thinking about the collar since the moment I started telling this story. The way it looked, sitting on that dais step in the empty throne room. Iron. Engraved with the sigil of the men who had hidden what was underneath it. Old and heavy and perfectly ordinary looking. The way the things that contain us are always ordinary looking from the outside. She wore it for 3 weeks. Before that, other covers, other scarves, the constant weight of concealment. Before that, 12 years old in a village with torches coming, watching her mother's face, understanding for the first time that the thing she'd always known was beautiful about her family was also the thing that made them a target. And then she stood in a throne room with 40 wolves watching, and let the hinge open and let them look. She had not planned it. It had happened to her in the end. The moment she'd been circling for 10 years, the exposure she'd been living in terror of, had arrived not on her terms, but on its own. The fault line had broken and the mark had been seen, and she had not crumbled. This is the thing I keep coming back to, not the crown, not the succession, not the old law, not the political consequence. The thing I keep coming back to is her face in that moment, the chin level, the complete stillness. A woman who had spent 10 years telling herself that visibility was death, standing fully visible in a room full of people who wanted things from her, and discovering, maybe for the first time since she was 12 years old, that she was still standing, that she had always been standing. The crown, when it settles, and it will settle, it's in the documents, it's in the old law, it's in the sealed acknowledgement of 4-pack lords, will be heavy. She knows this. She knew it on the wall walk, looking at the first star. She knows the birthright that killed her family is now hers to carry alone, and that carrying it is not going to stop the people who want the old line dead, and that visibility is still dangerous, and that the dread of it doesn't go away just because the hiding does. But here is what she also knows now, what I want you to leave here knowing. Destined said, I'll still be here. Not I will defend you. Not I will protect the crown. Still, here, the word a man uses when he understands that the thing he's committing to is not an event but a duration. And Nessa, who has been the cleverest person in every room she's entered since she was 12, who has counted the guards and noted the exits and pressed those crooked fingers together through every moment of danger and calculation. Nessa looked at him and did not look away. She wore a collar that covered a crown, and the crown was heavier than the iron, and she has always known it, and she is choosing to carry it anyway, not because she was born to it, not because the mark demands it, not because a bond or a law or an old provision written 4 centuries ago left her no other option, because standing in that throne room in the cold air with her neck bare and the whole room looking, she was still herself. The woman who counted guards and ate the bread and sat on the day step and asked to be seen before she asked to be saved. Still herself, entirely herself, after everything. That's what the collar was covering, not just a queen, a woman who turned out to be one.